Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission is, well, pretty straightforward.
Right. We take a stack of sources, all the articles, reports, notes you've got.
And we dive in to pull out the most important nuggets. We're basically here to give you the shortcut.
Yeah, a way to get quickly and thoroughly informed on what's happening right now.
Today, we're looking at a really interesting snapshot, aren't we? Global geopolitical stuff from May 22nd and 23rd, 2025.
Pulled directly from the material you provided. And as we went through it, a couple of big themes, really. Well, they jumped out.
They absolutely did. The first one, you just can't miss it, is how intensely interconnected everything is.
Totally. These sources make it so clear.
Things that seem isolated, like a policy change at a U.S. university or even a tragic shooting in D.C.
They're not happening in a vacuum at all. They have direct links, sometimes really surprising ones, to international tensions, overseas conflicts.
It's that ripple effect, crossing borders.
Exactly. And the other big theme from this material is that the world order feels, well, very much in flux.
You see that with traditional alliances, right? They seem visibly strained in some places.
Yeah, and new spheres of influence are sort of emerging. It definitely hints strongly at a potentially more multipolar world.
Where power isn't just centered in one or two big blocks anymore.
Right. So our plan today
is to walk you through the key developments across different regions, different themes, pulling only from what's in these sources.
Highlighting the surprising facts, distilling the critical insights.
To help you grasp not just what's happening, but maybe the why behind it, the forces, the connections.
So let's jump right in. Middle East seems like the place to start, based on the sources. Several critical things happening there.
Okay, starting with the situation on the ground in Gaza, it sounds incredibly grim.
It does. The sources detail a deepening humanitarian crisis. Reports of over 60 fatalities in just 24 hours.
Wow. And continued strikes across areas like Khan Yunis.
Deir al-Balah, Jabalia.
Yeah, it's ongoing. And the aid situation sounds dire, too.
Extremely. Severe restrictions are mentioned, worsening hunger, and experts warning about, imminent famine.
That's a point that really sticks out in the material, doesn't it?
It really does. There's that powerful quote included from the UN Secretary General.
One comparing the aid getting in.
Yeah, describing authorized aid as a teaspoon compared to the flood that's actually required.
A teaspoon versus a flood.
Oof. And critically, the sources say very little aid is even reaching northern Gaza.
That level of human suffering is obviously devastating right there, but what does this crisis mean globally, according to these sources?
Well, what's significant is the mounting international criticism it's generating.
Even from allies.
Yeah, the sources specifically note that even the U.S. has voiced concerns.
Which suggests potential diplomatic isolation for Israel.
It could, yes. And definitely increases pressure from the international community for maybe a change in approach or even intervention.
It's definitely notable when a key partner expresses that level of concern publicly.
It is. Now, related to those regional tensions, the sources also cover the latest on the U.S. and Iran nuclear talks.
Right. The fifth round just finished in Rome with Omani mediation.
That's it. And the outcome, as reported, is some, but not conclusive, progress.
Still stuck on the big issues, then.
Seems like it. The core disagreement is still Iran's high levels of uranium enrichment.
Which the U.S. wants stopped.
Demanding a halt, yes. And the sources have that very direct quote from Iran's foreign minister.
Oh, yeah. The zero enrichment, we do not have a deal.
Pretty unambiguous, right?
Definitely lays out their position.
And paired with that, the sources mention a dangerous escalation.
Which is?
Iran reportedly warned the U.S. it would be held legally responsible for any Israeli attack on its nuclear facilities.
Okay, wow. So you put that lack of progress together with that stark warning.
Yep.
What does that paint a picture of?
Well, the analysis in the material suggests this creates a dangerous escalation pathway. It just increases the risk of broader instability, maybe even military confrontation.
So the diplomatic off-ramp is looking pretty narrow.
It appears that way right now, yes.
And bringing one of those ripple effects much closer to home, the sources detail that awful incident in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, the fatal shooting outside the Capitol Jewish Museum. Just terrible.
2 Israeli embassy staffers killed.
Tragically, yes. The suspect, identified as Elias Rodriguez, is charged with first-degree murder.
And the key thing the sources highlight is the perpetrator's reported statement.
I did it for Palestine, I did it for Gaza, which led to hate crime and terrorism charges being considered.
Such a stark, tragic example of how these overseas conflicts can just manifest domestically.
It really is. The sources frame it as a clear instance of those global ripple effects, shows how the Israel-Hamas conflict can fuel, increased polarization, anti-Semitism, even far away in Western countries.
And underscores that challenge for authorities, keeping domestic security amid these intense international tensions.
A huge challenge. Now, shifting focus a bit within U.S. foreign policy, there's a notable reported policy reversal on Syria.
Right, the U.S. lifting some sanctions. This follows what the material called a surprise announcement from President Trump.
Exactly. Treasury and State reportedly issuing waivers to the Caesar Act.
The Syria Civilian Protection Act, yeah. And what do these waivers allow?
They authorize new investment, financial services, and transactions involving Syrian petroleum products.
And the stated goal is?
To facilitate basic services and reconstruction, after 13 years of civil war there.
The sources quote Secretary of State Marco Rubio on this,
saying it's the first step on delivering on the president's vision of a new relationship between Syria and the United States.
That feels like a pretty significant shift. How are the sources interpreting this?
Well, the analysis in the material suggests this policy reversal points to a more pragmatic pivot, maybe towards stabilizing Syria.
Possibly trying to counter Russian and Iranian influence? Or maybe leveraging reconstruction for U.S. economic interests?
Could be either, or both. It definitely points towards a potential sort of de facto engagement with the new government there.
Interesting. And staying within Syria for a moment, the sources also mention planned talks involving Syrian Kurdish parties.
Yes, talks between them and Damascus are reportedly planned.
And the Kurdish aim is?
To secure a federal Syria with regional autonomy.
But there's opposition.
Yeah, from Syria's interim president, Ahmed al-Shara, and also from Turkey.
And there was a significant development before this, wasn't it? The sources mentioned the Kurds changing tack.
That's right. Reportedly abandoned their push for full independence, aiming instead for integration.
Including transferring control of key assets, like oil fields, airports.
To the new government, yes. So this really marks a critical juncture for post-Assad Syria.
These talks will be a real test then. Federalism versus centralization.
Absolutely. And that opposition from Damascus and Turkey suggests, continued instability, potential conflict over autonomy.
Which impacts the whole region's stability.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, moving back to the U.S. and its foreign policy impact, President Trump reportedly announced new tariff threats.
Yeah, saw that in the sources. A social media announcement.
That's right, recommending a pretty substantial 50% tariff on all EU imports, starting June 1st.
50%? Wow. And he also threatened Apple specifically.
A 25% tariff on their products unless production moves to the U.S.
Which, the sources note, kind of contradicts his earlier claims about who actually pays for these tariffs.
Right, the claim that foreign nations would absorb the cost.
And European leaders, economists, they're warning about the impact.
Cited warning it would harm both sides, disrupt supply chains, lead to higher prices for consumers. Standard concerns, but maybe heightened now.
So what does this particular threat signal, especially hitting the EU like that?
It signals a clear continuation of that America First protectionist stance, a real risk of fragmenting global trade further.
And targeting the EU, maybe even higher than China in some ways.
The sources point that out, yeah. Suggests it's part of a broader economic nationalism strategy.
Which could alienate long-standing partners.
Exactly, pushing them maybe to seek other economic relationships. It's a real threat to the global economy, established supply chains.
Okay, here's where that theme of interconnectedness, domestic policy, global impact really comes through in the sources. The administration's reported action against Harvard.
Yeah, this is significant. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem reportedly revoked Harvard's authority to enroll international students.
And the stated reasons were?
Failure to adhere to the law, fostering violence, and accusations of anti-Semitism on campus. Those were the reasons given.
That's huge when you think about how many international students Harvard has. Over 6,800.
More than a quarter of their student body.
And Harvard's fighting back.
Called the action unlawful and is challenging it legally, according to the reports.
The sources put this in a wider context too, don't they?
Yes. Part of a broader crackdown on universities that have seen pro-Palestinian protests.
And there was also that accusation mentioned about Harvard coordinating with, who was it?
The Chinese Communist Party. That accusation is mentioned in the material as part of the context.
Okay. Help us understand why this action against one university has such big geopolitical implications.
Well, the sources highlight several things. Big implications for academic freedom, obviously, but also for U.S. soft power.
That ability to attract and influence through education and culture.
Exactly. And crucially, for the ability to attract global talent, especially, from places like China and India,
So it risks sending a message,
that the U.S. is maybe an unwelcoming environment for international students.
which could push that talent elsewhere, impacting innovation down the line.
Potentially, yeah. A big risk.
Another reported move from the Trump administration involves the National Security Council, the NSC.
Yes, significant reductions ordered there, according to the sources, involving the dismissal of dozens of policy experts.
It's stated aim.
Reduce bureaucracy, transfer operations back to the relevant agencies.
This comes after a period where the NSC's influence seemed diminished anyway.
Reportedly, yes. With more reliance on a smaller circle of advisors, the sources mention Secretary Rubio and Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy.
The analysis in the material suggests this points towards a kind of centralization.
A centralization of foreign policy decision-making, is how they put it.
And the potential downside.
The concern raised is it could lead to less institutional expertise in forming critical decisions.
Maybe making foreign policy more personalized, less predictable.
That's the suggestion, yes, which could have those ripple effects on global stability we keep talking about.
Okay, and finally, on the U.S. side for now, the sources describe a pretty tense meeting with South African President Ramaphosa.
Yeah, sounds like it was quite something. A tense Oval Office meeting.
Where President Trump reportedly lectured Ramaphosa.
And repeated what the sources call discredited claims about white genocide in South Africa, apparently even showed videos.
Wow. And Ramaphosa tried to steer things back.
Attempted to correct him, stressed the desire for better relations, trade. But the meeting reportedly spiraled out of control.
This really highlights the challenges in U.S.-Africa relations under this administration, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And the sources note the risk here. Alienating a key partner like South Africa,
Who's also a BRICS member.
right, could push them towards alternative alignments, maybe closer ties with China or Russia.
Ultimately diminishing U.S. influence on the continent.
That's the potential outcome highlighted. Okay, shall we shift our deep dive now towards the Russia-Ukraine war and European security?
Let's do it. President Putin has reportedly announced plans for a buffer zone.
He did, and Ukraine's reaction was swift.
Their foreign ministry spokesperson calling it aggressive.
And indicative that Russia is the obstacle to peace efforts. Pretty clear stance.
And the sources confirm no direct peace talks scheduled right now.
None. Despite those earlier suggestions from former President Trump after a call with Putin.
Meanwhile, the G7 finance ministers met.
Condemned the war, pledged to explore further sanctions, keeping the pressure on.
So this buffer zone announcement, what does it tell us about Russia's strategy here, according to the sources?
Well, the analysis suggests it's not really about seeking peace on Ukraine's terms.
More about digging in.
Exactly. Solidifying territorial gains, establishing de facto control over those border regions.
Which points towards a longer conflict.
Likely a prolonged conflict, continued tension, with Russia trying to dictate the terms, not really engaging in meaningful negotiation.
Now, here's something that speaks volumes about the threat perception in Europe.
Yeah.
Germany deploying troops permanently to Lithuania.
This is genuinely significant and historic.
A German heavy combat unit permanently stationed abroad.
First time since World War II. 4,800 soldiers. It's a big move.
And the context is those ongoing drone attacks bolstering NATO's eastern flank.
Right. And German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is quoted saying something quite direct.
What was that?
Basically, Lithuania's security is Germany's security. A very clear statement of commitment.
So this signifies a major and historic shift in German defense policy.
Absolutely. It shows a heightened threat perception from Russia, obviously, and a really concrete commitment to NATO collective defense.
Reinforces that militarization of NATO's border.
And signals a long-term strategic competition with Russia is now sort of baked in.
Our sources also touched on the IMF's work, didn't they? With Ukraine, but also Argentina?
They did. For Ukraine, discussions are ongoing for the 8th review of their EFF program.
Which could mean more money?
Potentially $520 million disbursement, though the sources note Ukraine's debt sustainability is rated restricted default right now.
Okay. And on the flip side, the IMF seems quite positive about Argentina.
Lauding President Milei's program, yeah. Noting impressive results, declining inflation, fiscal surplus.
And they approved a big new package for Argentina, too.
A new $20 billion EFF arrangement.
This contrast really highlights the IMF's role, doesn't it? in very different situations.
Critical role in global financial stability, yeah.
Yeah.
Engaging with nations in conflict like Ukraine or in deep economic distress like Argentina.
And it shows they're willing to back some bold, maybe even unconventional stabilization measures.
Which could influence policy choices elsewhere, potentially.
Now, a huge debate happening in the EU, according to the sources. Seizing those frozen Russian assets.
A really big one. Analysts are pushing hard for it, seizing roughly $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank money.
And the idea is to use that money for
funding Ukraine's massive reconstruction efforts. The scale is immense.
the Cape School of Economics estimated damage, $170 billion just for infrastructure.
And total reconstruction, maybe around $525 billion over 10 years. Huge numbers.
But currently, the EU is only diverting the interest from those assets, right?
Yeah.
Which is much smaller.
About $300 million a year, yeah. A tiny fraction.
So the argument for seizing the principal is
That it's just and necessary, citing Russia's war crimes, violations of international law.
but there's a hurdle.
A big one. The sources point to a lack of sufficient political will among the EU members for a full seizure.
Why is this debate so significant beyond just the money?
It highlights a major legal and political challenge globally, seizing sovereign assets on this scale.
It would set a massive precedent.
Huge. For accountability in conflicts, yes, but it could also fundamentally reshape how sovereign asset immunity works in the global financial system. Very high-stakes, complex implications.
And finally, on this European security front, NATO seems to be reaffirming its value, but maybe also broadening its focus.
That came through at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Dayton, Ohio, commemorating the Dayton Peace Accords.
U.S. and Balkan officials were there, affirming NATO's role.
Crucial role in global peace and stability, they said. The sources quote the U.S. Ambassador Matthew Whitaker,
What did he say?
that the U.S. needs allies. NATO is a great alliance to make sure that we're as strong as we possibly can be so we can have peace for generations to come. Strong affirmation.
And the sources noted a specific strategic point made there about Ukraine.
That supporting Ukraine's victory is seen as crucial to European stability.
And to deterring future invasions by other nations, particularly China.
Right. Explicitly mentioning deterring China signals that expanding strategic focus for NATO
Moving beyond just Europe and the North Atlantic.
reflects those broader geopolitical shifts we talked about earlier, reaffirms NATO's perceived relevance in this volatile world.
Okay, let's pivot our deep dive now towards the global economy and trade. Clearly a major area of geopolitical competition. The sources talk about the tech race.
Yeah, there's a study from Bruegel mentioned, based on patent data. It lays out a kind of hierarchy.
Okay.
U.S. leads in quantum computing, strong in AI too. China leads in semiconductors,
And the EU.
lagging significantly across all three, according to the study.
And the sources mention specific actions the U.S. is taking.
Like reportedly scrapping an AI diffusion rule, exploring things like data embassies, maybe with Saudi Arabia for chip access,
And China's pushing back.
countering U.S. delisting threats with regulatory changes to help its big tech companies globalize more.
This study, these actions, they point to a deepening divide, don't they?
A technological bifurcation is the term used between the U.S. and China. And this competition isn't just economic.
It's explicitly linked to national security future power.
Absolutely. The sources suggest this race will likely fuel more tech protectionism, more supply chain fragmentation.
Another significant shift reported in the material involves Bangladesh, apparently pivoting towards China.
Yes, the interim government there seems to be undertaking a significant foreign policy shift, moving away from that previous balancing act between India and China.
And the evidence cited.
Things like the chief advisor's first bilateral visit being to China, not India, securing $2.1 billion in investments, loans, grants from Beijing,
And China's gained some strategic footholds.
a $400 million deal to modernize Mangla Port, Bangladesh's second biggest seaport, and increased involvement in that contentious Teesta River project.
Which is sensitive because of its location near India's Chicken's Neck corridor.
Exactly. Very strategic location. This whole shift is reportedly straining relations with India.
Understandably, given the security concerns.
And it's raised concerns in Washington, too, apparently, especially with recent U.S. tariffs on some Bangladeshi imports adding another layer.
So the analysis suggests this deepens the competition in South Asia.
Very much so. Potentially making Bangladesh a battleground for influence between India and China.
It challenges India's traditional influence.
And complicates the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. It's a significant regional development.
Okay, shifting to energy. The sources point to a big milestone coming up for solar power.
Yeah, projected to surpass nuclear power generation globally this summer, June through August 2025.
That's huge. And a key reason is
Rapidly falling costs of LFP batteries, lithium iron phosphate. That's fueling the energy storage boom.
which is crucial for making renewables like solar more reliable on the grid.
Exactly. But there's a big but in the sources, too. A critical warning from the IEA
The International Energy Agency, what's the warning?
about copper. Global demand projected to fall 30% short by 2035 unless supply ramps up significantly.
And copper is essential for pretty much all things electrical, including renewables.
Right, so while solar surge is great news for the energy transition,
That copper warning points to a major potential bottleneck.
and suggests, according to the sources, intensified geopolitical competition for critical minerals, nations scrambling to secure resources for their clean energy futures.
Okay, finally in this section, China's BYD, the electric vehicle maker, expanding rapidly in Brazil,
Significantly increasing its footprint, yeah. The sources give examples.
like loaning vehicles to important institutions.
Planalto Presidential Palace, the Supreme Court, yeah. Plus, planning new factories, acquiring an old Ford plant, making buses, leveraging tariff reductions, too.
And there are concerns beyond just economics, right? Market saturation, dumping accusations, but also security.
Yes, crucially, the European Council on Foreign Relations is cited with a stark warning
Comparing the security challenge to?
to 5G networks, saying the EV challenge may be as significant, raising concerns about potential surveillance capabilities.
Wow. So what does this expansion plus those security flags represent in Latin America?
The sources frame it as strategic, economic, and technological penetration.
And those surveillance concerns highlight the dual-use nature of this tech.
Exactly. Commercial use, but potentially strategic purposes too, underscores the need for really robust national security frameworks as this tech spreads globally.
Okay, let's cover a few other significant international affairs mentioned in the sources, starting with Sudan, facing new U.S. sanctions.
That's the plan reported. New sanctions on the military-led government there.
And the reason given.
A determination that chemical weapons were used in 2024. Senior U.S. officials had previously pointed to chlorine gas use against the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces.
Though the State Department announcement didn't give specifics on where or how.
Not according to the sources, no. This just adds another layer to the already horrific humanitarian crisis there.
And it follows those recent discoveries of mass graves linked to RSF atrocities.
Right. The alleged chemical weapons use is a grave violation of international norms. It significantly elevates the severity of the conflict, as the sources put it.
Combined with the mass graves, it just increases the calls for accountability, doesn't it?
International accountability, war crimes investigations, maybe intervention, the pressure mounts.
And speaking of mass graves, the Sudanese army reported discoveries too.
Yes, in Al-Sala, southern Omdurman, mass graves containing 465 bodies, reportedly.
And they attribute these deaths to the RSF.
Stating the victims died from neglect, lack of food, treatment, and medicine in inhumane conditions at a school they were holding them in.
This wasn't the first such discovery by the army, was it?
No, the second major site reported follows 550 bodies found in northern Khartoum Bari back in March near an RSF compound.
The sources note Al-Sala was under RSF control before the army recaptured it.
These systematic discoveries, as the material calls them, really point to widespread atrocities, potential war crimes.
Demands immediate international action, doesn't it? Accountability, humanitarian access.
Absolutely. Intensifies the pressure to address the conflict's devastating human cost.
Okay, switching gears completely. A complex legal issue. A UK court blocking the Chagos Islands transfer.
Temporarily, yes. An interim injunction blocking the deal to transfer sovereignty to Mauritius.
And the case was brought by
2 Chagosian women, arguing they were unlawfully excluded from having a say in the island's future, after being forcibly displaced decades ago.
But this legal action clashes with the African Union's view.
Stands in direct contradiction, the sources say. The AU had welcomed the deal as a historic agreement, a promising model.
So this highlights those ongoing complexities in decolonization, right?
Yeah.
Especially indigenous rights.
Exactly. Legal, human rights complexities. It pits a state-level agreement against community rights. Could set a precedent.
Okay, another incident, seemingly domestic, but maybe with broader context.
Yeah.
The mass stabbing in Hamburg.
At the main train station, yeah. Terrible event. At least 17 injuries, 4 life-threatening.
A 39-year-old German woman was arrested. Police think she acted alone.
Possibly a psychological emergency. They found no evidence of a political motive found thus far. That's the initial assessment reported.
But the sources place it in context, right? Happening during rush hour, latest in a series of attacks in Germany.
Right. So while the initial frame is domestic, maybe psychological?
It still contributes to that broader sense of insecurity people might feel.
Exactly. Challenges authorities might influence talk about mental health, social integration, could lead to calls for more security in public places. Shows how domestic safety links to wider feelings.
Okay, and one last item from the sources. A detention in Georgia. An opposition leader.
Zurab Geopolitical, yeah. Placed in pretrial detention in Tbilisi.
This comes amid existing tensions, after accusations about the 2024 election being rigged.
And protests, yes. It escalates things. The reported reason for detention was him refusing to cooperate with a parliamentary inquiry he saw as politically motivated.
And critics are drawing parallels.
Accusing the government of authoritarian tactics mirroring Russia, raising alarms that this jeopardizes Georgia's EU membership hopes.
This signals what the sources call deepening democratic backsliding.
And directly puts those EU aspirations at risk. It really reinforces that geopolitical struggle in the South Caucasus.
Western integration versus Russian influence.
A flashpoint, potentially increasing instability there.
Wow. We've covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive.
We really have. And pulling it all together from the sources you provided.
It paints a picture of a world that's just incredibly dynamic, isn't it? Often volatile.
And fundamentally interconnected, like we said right at the start. That theme runs through everything.
Yeah, the key takeaways seem pretty clear. Persistent conflicts, huge human costs.
Economic strategies driven more and more by nationalism, by tech competition.
Alliances shifting significantly.
And those clear examples where domestic events just have undeniable international ties.
Navigating this kind of world, where something happening over there echoes right here, it really requires a nuanced understanding.
It's complex, constantly shifting, no easy answers.
This information you gave us provides a really powerful snapshot of just how fast things are changing, how linked everything is.
Hopefully useful for seeing the patterns.
Definitely. So to leave you, our listener, with something to think about, something to mull over based on all this.
A provocative thought.
Yeah. Given this snapshot we've discussed, how do you see those lines blurring between what happens strictly within a country's borders and what happens globally?
Oh, good question.
And maybe more importantly, what does that blurring mean for how we understand security, how we understand opportunity in this really interconnected world we're all in?
Something to reflect on, for sure. We hope this deep dive has offered some valuable insights into this complex moment.
Thanks for joining us.